Section 61 of the Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Deborah Lynn. The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker by Tobias Smollett. Section 61. To Dr. Lewis. Dear Doctor, if I was disposed to be critical, I should say this house of Cameron is too near the lake, which approaches on one side to within 6 or 7 yards of the window. It might have been placed in a higher site, which would have afforded a more extensive prospect and a drier atmosphere. But this imperfection is not chargeable on the present proprietor, who purchased it ready built, rather than be at the trouble of repairing his own family house of Bonhill, which stands 2 miles from hence on the Leven, so surrounded with plantation that it used to be known by the name of the Mavis, or Thrush Nest. Above that house is a romantic glen or clift of a mountain, covered with hanging woods, having at bottom a stream of fine water that forms a number of cascades in its descent to join the Leven, so that the scene is quite enchanting. A captain of a man of war, who had made the circuit of the globe with Mr. Anson, being conducted to this glen, exclaimed, "Juan Fernandez, by God!" Indeed, this country would be a perfect paradise, if it was not, like Wales, cursed with a weeping climate, owing to the same cause in both, the neighbourhood of high mountains, and a westerly situation, exposed to the vapours of the Atlantic Ocean. This air, however, notwithstanding its humidity, is so healthy, that the natives are scarce ever visited by any other disease than the small pox, and certain cutaneous evils, which are the effects of dirty living, the great and general reproach of the commonalty of this kingdom. Here are a great many living monuments of longevity, and among the rest a person, whom I treat with singular respect, as a venerable Druid, who has lived near 90 years, without pain or sickness, among oaks of his own planting. He was once proprietor of these lands, but being of a projecting spirit, some of his schemes miscarried, and he was obliged to part with his possession, which has shifted hands 2 or 3 times since that period, but every succeeding proprietor hath done every thing in his power to make his old age easy and comfortable. He has a sufficiency to procure the necessaries of life, and he and his old woman reside in a small convenient farmhouse, having a little garden, which he cultivates with his own hands. This ancient couple live in great health, peace, and harmony, and knowing no wants, enjoy the perfection of content. Mr. Smollett calls him the Admiral, because he insists upon steering his pleasure boat upon the lake, and he spends most of his time in ranging through the woods, which he declares he enjoys as much as if they were still his own property. I asked him the other day if he was never sick, and he answered, yes, he had a slight fever the year before the Union. If he was not deaf, I should take much pleasure in his conversation, for he is very intelligent, and his memory is surprisingly retentive. These are the happy effects of temperance, exercise, and good nature. Notwithstanding all his innocence, however, he was the cause of great perturbation to my man Clinker, whose natural superstition has been much injured by the histories of witches, fairies, ghosts, and goblins, which he has heard in this country. On the evening after our arrival, Humphrey strolled into the wood, in the course of his meditation, and all at once the Admiral stood before him under the shadow of a spreading oak. Though the fellow is far from being timorous in cases that are not supposed preternatural, he could not stand the sight of this apparition, but ran into the kitchen with his hair standing on end, staring wildly, and deprived of utterance. Mrs. Jenkins, seeing him in this condition, screamed aloud, "Lord have mercy upon us, he has seen something." Mrs. Tabitha was alarmed, and the whole house in confusion. When he was recruited with a dram, I desired him to explain the meaning of all this agitation, and with some reluctance he owned he had seen a spirit, in the shape of an old man with a white beard, a black cap, and a plaid nightgown. He was undeceived by the Admiral in person, who, coming in at this juncture, appeared to be a creature of real flesh and blood. Do you know how we fare in this Scottish paradise? We make free with our landlord's mutton, which is excellent, his poultry yard, his garden, his dairy, and his cellar, which are all well stored. We have delicious salmon, pike, trout, perch, parr, and sea, at the door for the taking. The Frith of Clyde, on the other side of the hill, supplies us with mullet, red and grey, cod, mackerel, whiting, and a variety of sea fish, including the finest fresh herrings I ever tasted. We have sweet juicy beef and tolerable veal, with delicate bread from the little town of Dunbritton, and plenty of partridge, grouse, heathcock, and other game in presents. We have been visited by all the gentlemen in the neighbourhood, and they have entertained us at their houses, not barely with hospitality, but with such marks of cordial affection as one would wish to find among near relations after an absence of many years. I told you in my last I had projected an excursion to the Highlands, which project I have now happily executed, under the auspices of Sir George Colquhoun, a colonel in the Dutch service, who offered himself as our conductor on this occasion. Leaving our women at Cameron to the care and inspection of Lady H.C., we set out on horseback for Inverary, the county town of Argyle, and dined on the road with the Laird of Macfarlane, the greatest genealogist I ever knew in any country, and perfectly acquainted with all the antiquities of Scotland. The Duke of Argyle has an old castle in Inverary, where he resides when he is in Scotland, and hard by is the shell of a noble Gothic palace, built by the last Duke, which, when finished, will be a great ornament to this part of the Highlands. As for Inverary, it is a place of very little importance. This country is amazingly wild, especially towards the mountains, which are heaped upon the backs of one another, making a most stupendous appearance of savage nature, with hardly any signs of cultivation, or even of population. All is sublimity, silence, and solitude. The people live together in glens or bottoms, where they are sheltered from the cold and storms of winter, but there is a margin of plain ground spread along the sea-side, which is well inhabited and improved by the arts of husbandry, and this I take to be one of the most agreeable tracts of the whole island. The sea not only keeps it warm and supplies it with fish, but affords one of the most ravishing prospects in the whole world. I mean the appearance of the Hebrides, or western islands, to the number of 300, scattered as far as the eye can reach, in the most agreeable confusion. As the soil and climate of the Highlands are but ill adapted to the cultivation of corn, the people apply themselves chiefly to the breeding and feeding of black cattle, which turn to good account. Those animals run wild all the winter, without any shelter or subsistence but what they can find among the heath. When the snow lies so deep and hard that they cannot penetrate to the roots of the grass, they make a diurnal progress, guided by a sure instinct, to the seaside at low water, where they feed on the alga marina and other plants that grow upon the beach. Perhaps this branch of husbandry, which required very little attendance and labour, is one of the principal causes of that idleness and want of industry which distinguishes these mountaineers in their own country. When they come forth into the world, they become as diligent and alert as any people upon earth. They are undoubtedly a very distinct species from their fellow subjects of the lowlands, against whom they indulge an ancient spirit of animosity, and this difference is very discernible even among persons of family and education. The lowlanders are generally cool and circumspect, the Highlanders fiery and ferocious. But this violence of their passions serves only to inflame the zeal of their devotion to strangers, which is truly enthusiastic. We proceeded about 20 miles beyond Inverary to the house of a gentleman, a friend of our conductor, where we stayed a few days, and were feasted in such a manner that I began to dread the consequence to my constitution. Notwithstanding the solitude that prevails among these mountains, there is no want of people in the Highlands. I am credibly informed that the Duke of Argyle can assemble 5,000 men in arms of his own clan and surname, which is Campbell, and there is besides a tribe of the same appellation, whose chief is the Earl of Breadalbane. The Macdonalds are as numerous and remarkably warlike. The Camerons, M'Leods, Frasers, Grants, Mackenzies, Mackays, Macphersons, M'Intoshes are powerful clans, so that if all the Highlanders, including the inhabitants of the Isles, were united, they could bring into the field an army of 40,000 fighting men, capable of undertaking the most dangerous enterprise. We have lived to see 4,000 of them, without discipline, throw the whole kingdom of Great Britain into confusion. They attacked and defeated 2 armies of regular troops accustomed to service. They penetrated into the centre of England, and afterwards marched back with deliberation in the face of 2 other armies through an enemy's country, where every precaution was taken to cut off their retreat. I know not any other people in Europe who, without the use or knowledge of arms, will attack regular forces sword in hand, if their chief will head them in battle. When disciplined, they cannot fail of being excellent soldiers. They do not walk like the generality of mankind, but trot and bounce like deer, as if they moved upon springs. They greatly excel the Lowlanders in all the exercises that require agility. They are incredibly abstemious, and patient of hunger and fatigue, so steeled against the weather that in travelling, even when the ground is covered with snow, they never look for a house or any other shelter but their plaid, in which they wrap themselves up and go to sleep under the cope of heaven. Such people, in quality of soldiers, must be invincible, when the business is to perform quick marches in a difficult country, to strike sudden strokes, beat up the enemy's quarters, harass their cavalry, and perform expeditions without the formality of magazines, baggage, forage, and artillery. The chieftainship of the Highlanders is a very dangerous influence, operating at the extremity of the island, where the eyes and hands of government cannot be supposed to see and act with precision and vigour. In order to break the force of clanship, administration has always practised the political maxim, divide et impera. The legislature hath not only disarmed these mountaineers, but also deprived them of their ancient garb, which contributed in a great measure to keep up their military spirit, and their slavish tenures are all dissolved by act of Parliament, so that they are at present as free and independent of their chiefs as the law can make them. But the original attachment still remains, and is founded on something prior to the feudal system, about which the writers of this age have made such a pother, as if it was a new discovery, like the Copernican system. Every peculiarity of policy, custom, and even temperament is affectedly traced to this origin, as if the feudal constitution had not been common to almost all the natives of Europe. For my part, I expect to see the use of trunk hose and buttered ale ascribed to the influence of the feudal system. The connection between the clans and their chiefs is, without all doubt, patriarchal. It is founded on hereditary regard and affection, cherished through a long succession of ages. The clan consider the chief as their father. They bear his name, they believe themselves descended from his family, and they obey him as their lord with all the ardour of filial love and veneration, while he, on his part, exerts a paternal authority, commanding, chastising, rewarding, protecting, and maintaining them as his own children. If the legislature would entirely destroy this connection, it must compel the Highlanders to change their habitation and their names. Even this experiment has been formerly tried without success. In the reign of James VI, the battle was fought within a few short miles of this place, between 2 clans, the MacGregors and the Colquhouns, in which the latter were defeated. The Laird of MacGregor made such a barbarous use of his victory, that he was forfeited and outlawed by act of Parliament. His lands were given to the family of Montrose, and his clan were obliged to change their name. They obeyed so far as to call themselves severally Campbell, Graham, or Drummond, the surnames of the families of Argyle, Montrose, and Perth, that they might enjoy the protection of those houses, but they still added MacGregor to their new appellation, and as their chief was deprived of his estate, they robbed and plundered for his subsistence. Mr. Cameron of Lochiel, the chief of that clan, whose father was attainted for having been concerned in the last rebellion, returning from France in obedience to a proclamation and act of Parliament, passed at the beginning of the late war, paid a visit to his own country, and hired a farm in the neighbourhood of his father's house, which had been burnt to the ground. The clan, though ruined and scattered, no sooner heard of his arrival than they flocked to him from all quarters to welcome his return, and in a few days stocked his farm with 700 black cattle, which they had saved in the general wreck of their affairs. But their beloved chief, who was a promising youth, did not live to enjoy the fruits of their fidelity and attachment. The most effectual method I know to weaken and at length destroy this influence is to employ the commonalty in such a manner as to give them a taste of property and independence. In vain the government grants them advantageous leases on the forfeited estates, if they have no property to prosecute the means of improvement. The sea is an inexhaustible fund of riches, but the fishery cannot be carried on without vessels, casks, salt, lines, nets, and other tackle. I conversed with a sensible man of this country, who, from a real spirit of patriotism, had set up a fishery on the coast, and a manufacture of coarse linen for the employment of the poor Highlanders. Cod is here in such plenty, that he told me he had seen several hundred taken on one line at one haul. It must be observed, however, that the line was of immense length, and had 2,000 hooks baited with mussels. But the fish was so superior to the cod caught on the banks of Newfoundland, that his correspondent at Lisbon sold them immediately at his own price, although Lent was just over when they arrived, and the people might be supposed quite cloyed with this kind of diet. His linen manufacture was likewise in a prosperous way, when the late war intervening, all his best hands were pressed into the service. It cannot be expected that the gentlemen of this country should execute commercial schemes to render their vassals independent; nor indeed are such schemes suited to their way of life and inclination. But a company of merchants might, with proper management, turn to good account a fishery established in this part of Scotland. Our people have a strange itch to colonize America, when the uncultivated parts of our own island might be settled to greater advantage. After having rambled through the mountains and glens of Argyle, we visited the adjacent islands of Islay, Jura, Mull, and Icolmkill. In the first we saw the remains of a castle, built in a lake, where Macdonald, Lord or King of the Isles, formerly resided. Jura is famous for having given birth to one Macrane, who lived 180 years in one house, and died in the reign of Charles II. Mull affords several bays, where there is safe anchorage; in one of which, the Florida, a ship of the Spanish Armada, was blown up by one of Mr. Smollett's ancestors. About 40 years ago, John, Duke of Argyle, is said to have consulted the Spanish registers, by which it appeared that this ship had the military chest on board. He employed experienced divers to examine the wreck, and they found the hull of the vessel still entire, but so covered with sand that they could not make their way between decks. However, they picked up several pieces of plate that were scattered about in the bay, and a couple of fine brass cannon. Icolmkill, or Iona, is a small island which St. Columba chose for his habitation. It was respected for its sanctity, and college or seminary of ecclesiastics. Part of its church is still standing, with the tombs of several Scottish, Irish, and Danish sovereigns who were here interred. These islanders are very bold and dexterous watermen, consequently the better adapted to the fishery. In their manners they are less savage and impetuous than their countrymen on the continent, and they speak the Erse or Gaelic in its greatest purity. Having sent round our horses by land, we embarked in the district of Cowal, for Greenock, which is a neat little town on the other side of the Frith, with a curious harbour formed by 3 stone jetties carried out a good way into the sea. Newport Glasgow is such another place, about 2 miles higher up. Both have a face of business and plenty, and are supported entirely by the shipping of Glasgow, of which I counted 60 large vessels in these harbours. Taking boat again at Newport, we were in less than an hour landed on the other side, within 2 short miles of our headquarters, where we found our women in good health and spirits. They had been 2 days before joined by Mr. Smollett and his lady, to whom we have such obligations as I cannot mention, even to you, without blushing. Tomorrow we shall bid adieu to the Scotch Arcadia, and begin our progress to the southward, taking our way by Lanark and Nithsdale to the west borders of England. I have received so much advantage and satisfaction from this tour, that if my health suffers no revolution in the winter, I believe I shall be tempted to undertake another expedition to the northern extremity of Caithness, unencumbered by those impediments which now clog the heels of yours, Mat Bramble, Cameron, September 6th. End of Section 61.